Cyclist disappeared in 2018. 7 years later, map app logs last route and points to. The first thing that hit him was the smell. Not the sterile lemon-scented cleaner of the precinct, or the stale coffee that perpetually brewed in the corner, but a cloying, sweet decay. It was the smell of forgotten things, of memories left to rot in the damp, dark corners of the world. Detective Miles Corbin, his face a roadmap of too many sleepless nights and too few easy days, felt the scent cling to the back of his throat, a ghost of a taste he couldn't place. It was 2025, a world of holographic ads and self-driving cars. Yet here he was, staring at a ghost from 2018. A ghost on a screen. "You're not going to believe this, Miles," said Officer Chen, a kid barely old enough to remember a time before universal data linkage. His eyes, wide and perpetually glued to some screen or another, were fixed on the monitor with an almost religious reverence. The old GeoTrace servers, they've been running a deep data recovery protocol, part of the new federal mandate to archive cold case digital footprints. They're pulling fragments from old decommissioned satellites, cell tower pings, Wi-Fi handshakes. Stuff that was thought to be wiped years ago. Miles grunted, a sound of profound disinterest. He'd been working cold cases for a decade. They were a morgue of maybes and what-ifs, a graveyard of forgotten names and faded photographs. Hope was a currency he had long since spent, and, he rasped, his voice rough with the dregs of last night's bourbon, and Chen said, leaning back, the fluorescent lights glinting off the polished chrome of his cybernetic arm, a sleek, state-of-the-art limb that was more capable than Miles's own flesh and blood. "We got a hit. A big one. On the Alara Vance case." The name struck Miles like a physical blow. Alara Vance, the cyclist, the golden girl, a 22-year-old with a smile that could disarm armies and a future as bright as the sun she loved to ride under. She had vanished on a crisp October afternoon in 2018. Her canary yellow bicycle found abandoned on the edge of the Redwood National and State Parks. A place of ancient, silent giants. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, just gone. The case had consumed the nation for months, a media frenzy of talking heads and armchair detectives, before slowly, inevitably, fading into the static of the next tragedy. Miles leaned closer. His own reflection, a pale, haunted mask on the screen. He saw the map first. A familiar stretch of Highway 101, winding like a serpent through the colossal trees, but overlaid on it was a new line, a faint, pulsating blue line that wasn't there before. "What is that?" Miles breathed, the words catching in his throat. "It's her," Chen said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's Elaros GeoTrace route. The final one." The app on her phone was active, pinging, even after she disappeared. The data was just lost, corrupted, fragmented across a dozen dead servers. Until now, they pieced it together. Miles, every turn, every stop. The blue line was a spectral artery, tracing Elaro's last ride. It followed the known path, the winding road where her bike was found. But then, it did something impossible. It diverged. It left the smooth, paved certainty of the highway and veered sharply into the dense, dark green of the park, a place where no bicycle could go. It wasn't a trail. It was a jagged, erratic path, cutting through thick undergrowth, over streams. Deeper and deeper into the forest's suffocating embrace, Miles's heart began to pound. A heavy, frantic drum against his ribs. He felt a cold dread, the kind that starts in the pit of your stomach and spreads like ice through your veins. How is that possible? She was on a road bike. Exactly, Chen said, pointing a gleaming metallic finger at the screen. The algorithm flagged it as an anomaly. The speed, the terrain, it didn't match the user's registered vehicle, a bicycle. The system thinks the phone was in a car or being carried. The blue line pulsed, a slow, steady heartbeat on the screen. It snaked 4 miles into the wilderness, a digital breadcrumb trail left by a ghost, and then, it stopped. It stopped at a single, blinking red dot. A final, definitive point in the middle of nowhere. A place the original search parties, with Their dogs and helicopters and hundreds of volunteers had never even thought to look. It was miles from any known trail. In a part of the park so dense and remote it was labeled on maps as impassable terrain. The final ping, Chen said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and horror. The phone's battery died right there. That's the last place it was active. Geo-coordinates are precise, down to the meter. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the servers and the frantic thumping of Miles's own heart. He stared at the red dot, a tiny digital tombstone in a sea of green. 7 years. 7 years of silence, of her parents. Hollowed-out eyes on the evening news, of a case file that grew thicker with dead-end leads and thinner with hope. And now, this. A map. A final damning finger pointing to a single spot on the earth. Who owns that land? Miles asked, his voice a low growl. Chun's fingers flew across his keyboard, a blur of chrome and light. He pulled up property records, satellite images, a cascade of data that painted a picture of the location. It's private property, has been for over a century, a huge parcel of old-growth forest, right in the heart of the park. Legally grandfathered in before the national park was established. Belongs to one family. He paused, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as the name appeared on the screen. He turned to Miles, his face pale. You're not going to like this. Just say the name, Chen, Miles snapped, his patience worn thin. The judge, Chen said. The words hanging in the air like a death sentence. It belongs to Judge Alistair Hawthorne. The name hit Miles with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Judge Alistair Hawthorne, the lion of the Northern California judiciary, a man of immense power, of unimpeachable reputation, a pillar of the community, a patron of the arts, a man who had personally overseen the funding for the new wing of the Children's Hospital. He was a local legend, a man whose name was synonymous with justice and integrity. He had even, in a cruel twist of irony, publicly offered his condolences to the Vance family back in 2018. His face a mask of solemn, fatherly concern on every news channel. His sprawling, secluded estate, a fortress of old money and older secrets, was a local landmark, a place whispered about but rarely seen. And that estate, that fortress of power and privilege, was precisely where the red dot blinked. A cold, sickening certainty washed over Miles. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was something else entirely. Something darker. More monstrous than he could have imagined. The power imbalance was a chasm, a gaping, unbridgeable void between a 22-year-old girl on a bicycle and a man who held the lives and fates of others in his hands every single day. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Get a warrant, Miles said, his voice low and dangerous. A full-spectrum warrant. Soil analysis, ground-penetrating radar. The works. I want every inch of that property turned upside down. Chen hesitated, his cybernetic hand hovering over the keyboard. Miles, it's Judge Hawthorne. The DA will never sign off on it. Not based on a 7-year-old data fragment from a defunct app. It's political suicide. I don't give a damn about politics, Miles snarled, his eyes locked on the blinking red dot. A girl is dead, and I think I know who killed her. The screen seemed to mock him. The red dot, a single unblinking eye in the heart of the forest. It was a digital ghost, a silent accusation that had waited 7 years to be heard. The smell of decay was stronger now, a phantom scent in the sterile air of the precinct. It was the smell of secrets. The smell of the grave. And as Miles stared at the map, at the final damning destination of Elara Vance's last ride, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was about to dig up a monster. And he knew, with an even deeper, more terrifying certainty, that the monster would not be unearthed without a fight. The cliffhanger wasn't just on the screen, it was in the air, a palpable tension that promised a storm. The ghost of Elara Vance had finally pointed the way, and her finger was aimed directly at the heart of a man who was supposed to be the embodiment of justice itself. The quiet, forgotten case was about to explode into a scandal that would tear the community, and the very concept of justice, apart. The blinking red dot was no longer just a location. It was a declaration of war, and Miles Corbin, a man with nothing left to lose, was ready to fight. He felt the years peel away, the cynicism and exhaustion replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. He was back in 2018, seeing Ilara's face on the missing posters, the vibrant life in her eyes. He remembered the desperate hope in her parents' voices, a hope he had watched curdle into a permanent, aching grief. For 7 years, that grief had been a quiet, private affair. Now, it was about to become a public spectacle. The weight of those 7 years, of the silence and the lies, settled on his shoulders. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal need for answers, for retribution. The blinking red dot was a promise of a reckoning. And as he walked out of the room, leaving Chen to grapple with the political fallout of his request, Miles knew that this was more than a case. It was a crusade. He was going to that property. Warrant or no warrant. He was going to stand on that patch of ground and find out what secrets it held. He owed it to the girl with the canary yellow bike. He owed it to her parents. He owed it to himself. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and Miles Corbin was listening. The silence was over. The screaming was about to begin. The drive north was a blur of towering redwoods and annoying unease. Miles drove his own car, a relic from a bygone era, a gas-guzzling beast of American steel that felt as out of place in this world of silent electric vehicles as he did. He'd left Chen to fight the bureaucratic war, knowing it was a battle that would be waged in hushed tones in corner offices. A war of political calculus and carefully worded emails. Miles had no patience for such things. His war was with the earth, with the secrets it held buried beneath a blanket of soil and time. He didn't have a warrant. He knew he wouldn't get one. Not yet, but he had something else. He had the coordinates. A secret whispered from the digital grave. He parked his car on the shoulder of the highway, a mile from the Hawthorne Estate's main gate, and stepped out into the crisp, cool air of the forest. The air was different here, cleaner, sharper. It smelled of pine and damp earth, of ancient things that had stood silent witness to the comings and goings of men for centuries. He checked the map on his phone one last time. The red dot was a beacon, a siren call. It was a 2-mile hike through dense, unforgiving terrain. He was no longer a young man. His knees ached with a dull, persistent throb, a reminder of a long-ago chase that had ended with a torn ACL and a month on disability. But he pushed the pain aside. He had a ghost to find. He slipped through the old rusted barbed wire fence that marked the edge of the Hawthorne property, the metal prongs tearing a small rip in his jacket. He was trespassing. He knew it. But the law felt like a flimsy, irrelevant thing in the face of what he was doing. He was an avenging angel, a bloodhound on a scent that had gone cold 7 years ago. The forest floor was a thick carpet of fallen needles and decaying leaves, muffling the sound of his footsteps. The canopy of the redwoods was so dense that it blotted out the sun, plunging the world into a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, more profound. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of unspoken things, of secrets soaked into the very soil. He followed the GPS on his phone, his eyes darting back and forth, scanning the undergrowth, the ancient trees, looking for any sign, any disturbance in the natural order of things. A piece of torn clothing, a glint of metal, anything. But there was nothing. Only the relentless, suffocating beauty of the forest. He pushed through thickets of ferns, their fronds cool and wet against his face. He scrambled over fallen logs, their bark slick with moss. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was getting closer. The GPS showed him only a few hundred yards away, and then he saw it. A break in the trees, a small clearing, bathed in a sliver of sunlight that had managed to pierce the dense canopy. In the center of the clearing stood a single, massive redwood, a giant even among giants. Its bark was gnarled and scarred, its branches reaching towards the sky like 1,000 grasping arms. His phone buzzed in his hand. The GPS showed the red dot, blinking, right at the base of that tree. He had arrived. He was standing on the spot where Ilara Vance's phone had died, the place where her digital life had ended. He approached the tree slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. The air was thick with a strange, palpable tension. The clearing was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Just a heavy, expectant silence. He circled the base of the tree, his eyes scanning the ground. The earth was soft, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. He knelt down, his bad knee screaming in protest, and began to dig with his bare hands. He clawed at the soil, the dirt cool and damp beneath his fingernails. He dug until his fingers were raw, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. And then he felt it. Something hard. Something that wasn't a rock or a root. His heart leaped into his throat. He dug faster, more frantically, his movements fueled by a desperate, terrifying hope. He cleared away the last of the dirt, and his breath caught in his chest. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age and dirt. He recognized it instantly. It was the locket Ilara was wearing in all of her pictures, a family heirloom her mother had spoken of through tears during the initial investigation. He pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside, a tiny faded photograph of a smiling young couple, Ilara's parents. A wave of nausea washed over him. He had found it. He had found her. He looked around the clearing, his eyes wild with a mixture of triumph and horror. He had found her grave. A makeshift, unmarked grave at the foot of a silent, ancient tree. He stood up, his body trembling. The locket clutched in his hand. He had the proof he needed. This was more than a data fragment now. This was a crime scene. A tomb. He turned to leave, to go back to his car, to call for backup. To finally bring the full weight of the law down on this place. But as he turned, he froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees, was a figure, a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple rugged clothes of a groundskeeper. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes cold and empty. And in his hands, he held a rifle. It was pointed directly at Miles's chest. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the silent air. "The judge, he doesn't like visitors." Miles's hand instinctively went to his own weapon, but he knew he was too slow. The man with the rifle was a predator in his natural habitat. And Miles was an intruder, a clumsy city-bred animal far from his own territory. The cliffhanger was no longer digital. It was a cold, hard piece of steel aimed at his heart. The silence of the forest had been broken, not by a scream, but by the quiet, deadly promise of violence. He had found the ghost's resting place, but in doing so, he had stumbled into the monster's lair. And the monster was awake, and it was hungry. The search for Ilara Vance had just claimed a new potential victim. Ilara Vance, the name, was a sunbeam. A memory of warmth on a summer afternoon. She was all flying blonde hair and scraped knees, a creature of perpetual motion. Her father, Thomas Vance, a man whose hands were more comfortable with the feel of oiled wood and polished frets than with the crushing weight of grief, remembered her laughter most of all. It was a sound like wind chimes, a melody that had once filled every corner of their small, cluttered house. Now, the house was just cluttered and silent. The guitars he built, works of art coveted by musicians around the world, stood in their cases, their strings slack, their voices mute. He hadn't been able to play, not really, since she'd gone. The music had died with her. Ilara had been his prodigy, not with music, but with life. She attacked it with a fearless joy that both thrilled and terrified him. She'd built her first bike from spare parts, scavenged from the local dump. Her small hands, usually smudged with grease and dirt, surprisingly deft. The canary yellow frame she'd painted herself, a beacon of defiant cheerfulness. "So you can always see me coming, Dad," she'd said, her smile missing a front tooth. He saw her now, in his mind's eye, a phantom on a yellow bike, forever pedaling towards a horizon she would never reach. His wife, Sarah, had withered. The vibrant fiery artist who had painted canvases that blazed with color now moved through their home like a ghost, her palette a uniform, muted gray. Their shared past was a gallery of happy memories they could no longer bear to visit. The secret they shared was not a dark one, but one of aching, unspoken sorrow. They had both, in their own ways, given up. They spoke of Alara in the past tense, a closed chapter, a story with a tragic, unresolved ending. The hope that had once burned so fiercely had been reduced to a single, flickering ember, a fragile thing they protected from the winds of reality, the quiet, dreadful certainty that their daughter was never coming home. Her room was a shrine. Untouched, the cycling trophies gleaming on the shelves, a testament to a life cut brutally short. The brokenness of their past was the gaping, unfillable hole at the center of their present. Alistair Hawthorne lived in a world of curated silence. His estate was a fortress against the untidiness of the world, a monument to control. The redwoods that surrounded his property were not just trees, they were sentinels, guardians of a meticulously crafted reality. The judge, as he was universally known, was a man who had built his life on the foundations of order and precedent. His courtroom was a theater where he was the sole director, his pronouncements shaping the lives of lesser mortals. But the order was a facade, a carefully constructed dam holding back a flood of secrets. His past was not broken. It was buried deep beneath the foundations of the house, beneath the ancient roots of the trees, in the same dark, secret earth that held other more tangible things. His secret was a hunger, a monstrous, insatiable appetite he had learned to conceal. Behind a mask of civic virtue and judicial gravitas, he craved the wild, the untamed, the very chaos he purported to fight against in his courtroom. He found it in the raw, untamed wilderness of his own backyard, a place where the laws of man did not apply, where he was the only law. His interactions were not with people, but with subjects. His wife, a fragile porcelain doll of a woman, had long ago retreated into a world of prescription pills and vapid social engagements. A willing prisoner in their gilded cage, his son Julian was his greatest disappointment. A boy born of privilege, who had none of his father's iron will, none of his predatory instinct. Julian was a creature of soft edges and artistic sensibilities, a constant, galling reminder of a weakness Alistair could not tolerate. The judge's wound was not a wound at all. It was a void, a chilling emptiness where a conscience should have been. He felt no remorse, no guilt, only a cold, reptilian satisfaction in his own power. Alara Vance had not been the first. Just the one who had, through some fluke of digital necromancy, refused to stay buried, the man in the clearing. The one with the rifle and the dead eyes was named Cain. He was not just a grounds, he was the judge's shadow, his confessor, his executioner. He was a man with no past, or rather, a past he had systematically erased. He had come to the judge years ago, a runaway from a life of petty crime and brutal foster homes, a boy with nothing to his name but a feral cunning and a capacity for violence. The judge had seen the potential in him, the raw, unformed clay of a loyal soldier. He had given Cain a home, a purpose, a name, and in return, Cain had given him his soul. He was the hidden witness, the one who saw everything, the one who buried the secrets. His hands, calloused and strong, knew the weight of a shovel, the soft give of freshly turned earth. He lived in a small cabin, on the far edge of the property, a ghost in the machine of the Hawthorne estate. His emotional wound was a twisted, gnarled thing. Loyalty, a fierce, unthinking devotion to the man who had saved him, a man he knew to be a monster. He was trapped, not by fear, but by a perverse sense of gratitude. He was the keeper of the gate, the guardian of the grave, and he would kill to protect the man who had given him everything, the man who had, in the process, taken away his humanity. The struggle between his fear of the judge's wrath and the flicker of a long-dormant conscience was a silent, internal war he fought every day in the suffocating silence of the redwoods. He saw Ilara's face in his dreams, her eyes wide with terror, a mirror of the terrified boy he had once been. But then he would wake, and the loyalty, the debt, would wash it all away. He was the judge's creature, and he would do his master's bidding, always. The first meeting between Miles and the Vances after the discovery of the locket was a study in controlled devastation. It took place in the sterile, impersonal environment of a police interrogation room, a place designed to strip away emotion, to lay bare the truth. But the grief in that room was a living, breathing entity, a thick, suffocating fog. Thomas Vance, his luteur's hands trembling, held the small silver locket as if it were a sacred relic. He didn't cry, his sorrow was too deep for tears. It was a hollow, echoing emptiness in his eyes, the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own soul reflected back at him. Sarah Vance, however, wept, not with the loud, cathartic sobs of fresh grief, but with a quiet, ceaseless weeping that seemed to come from a place of permanent, irreparable damage. The tears tracked clean paths through the dusty mask of neglect that had settled on her face. "Hers," Thomas whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "I gave it to her for her 16th birthday." He looked up at Miles, his eyes pleading. "Where did you find this? You have to tell us." Miles felt a knot tighten in his gut. He could see the fragile ember of hope flickering back to life in their eyes, and he knew he was about to extinguish it. "We found it on a piece of private property. Deep in the park." He chose his words carefully. The name of the owner, a venomous thing on his tongue. "The property belongs to Judge Alistair Hawthorne." The name hung in the air for a moment, meaningless. Then, a flicker of recognition in Thomas's eyes. The judge, the man who he spoke at the vigil. He offered a reward. The confusion on his face was slowly, horrifyingly, replaced by a dawning, monstrous understanding. The power imbalance was stark, visceral, a craftsman, an artist, a grieving father, against a man who was the very symbol of law and order. Sarah's weeping stopped. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and raw, locking onto Miles's. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We believe Ilara. We believe she may have ended up on his property the day she disappeared," Miles said, the euphemism tasting like ash in his mouth. The injustice of it was a palpable force in the room. The man who had publicly mourned their daughter, who had offered them his solemn, empty condolences, was now the prime suspect in her disappearance. The betrayal was a fresh, gaping wound on top of the old one. The scene shifts. We are inside the Hawthorne mansion. It is a place of oppressive, suffocating elegance. The air is still. The light filtered through heavy, velvet curtains. Judge Hawthorne is in his study, a room paneled in dark, gleaming mahogany, lined with leather-bound books he has never read. He is a man in his late 60s, but he carries himself with the rigid, unyielding posture of a much younger man. His face is a mask of patrician control, his eyes the color of a winter sky. Across from him, his son Julian slumps in a chair. Julian is in his late 20s, his face pale and sensitive, his eyes holding a perpetually haunted look. He is an artist, a painter, but his canvases are all abstract, chaotic swirls of color, a visual representation of the turmoil within him. "The police were here," Julian says, his voice thin, reedy. "They had questions. About the property. About 2018. The judge does not look up from the legal brief he is reading. He turns a page, the crisp sound of the paper the only noise in the room. "And what did you tell them?" he asks, his voice a low, emotionless monotone. "Nothing," Julian says, his hands twisting in his lap. "I told them I didn't know." "Anything good?" the judge says, still not looking up. "Father," Julian says, his voice cracking. "That girl, the cyclist. I remember her. I saw her that day, on the road, near the gate." Now, the judge looks up. His eyes are cold, flat, devoid of any emotion. They are the eyes of a shark. You saw nothing, he says, his voice dropping, becoming a quiet, menacing hiss. You were in your studio. All day. You were working. You had a headache, you remember? Julian flinches as if struck. He stares at his father, his eyes wide with a familiar mixture of fear and loathing. This is a script they have rehearsed before, in other contexts, for other, smaller transgressions. The secret between them is not just what happened to Vance, it is a lifetime of secrets. Of Julian's silent, terrified complicity in his father's darkness. He is the witness, but a witness whose silence has been bought and paid for with a life of luxury and a soul corroded by fear. Double quotes. Yes, Father. Julian whispers, his eyes dropping to the floor. I remember, I had a headache. The judge turns back to his brief, dismissing his son as one would dismiss a servant. The power dynamic is absolute. The father is the king, the son, a terrified subject. The cruelty is not in violence, but in the cold, calculated erasure of Julian's own reality, his own memory. The final scene of this section returns to Cain, the groundskeeper. He is in his small Spartan cabin, cleaning his rifle. The weapon is immaculate, a tool he respects and understands. He is a man of few words and fewer comforts. On a small rickety table next to his bed is a single, framed photograph. It is not of a person. It is a picture of a canary yellow bicycle, leaning against a redwood tree. The photograph is slightly crumpled, as if it has been carried in a pocket for a long time. It is a piece of evidence, a memento, a reminder, a relic, from the day he helped his master bury a secret. He picks up the photograph, his rough, calloused thumb tracing the outline of the bicycle. His face is impassive, but his eyes, for a brief, unguarded moment, betray a flicker of something. It is not guilt, it is something older, something deeper. It is the ghost of the boy he used to be. The boy who was lost and alone. The boy who would have understood the terror in Alara Vance's eyes. He is the hidden witness, the man who holds the key, but the lock is his own loyalty, a loyalty forged. In fear and gratitude, he puts the photograph down. His face, once again, a mask of stony indifference. He has made his choice. He is the judge's man. And he will carry that secret, and all the others, to his grave. The weight of his silence is the price of his salvation. And he pays it, every single day, in the crushing, eternal silence of the redwoods. The days that followed the discovery of the locket were a slow, grinding escalation of a war fought on two fronts. One was a war of nerves, of psychological pressure and quiet intimidation. The other was a war of attrition, of legal maneuvering and bureaucratic obstruction. For Miles Corbin, it was like punching water. For the Vance family, it was a fresh hell, a daily torment of hope and despair. Judge Hawthorne, cloaked in the armor of his reputation and the impenetrable fortress of his legal connections, remained untouchable. The district attorney, a man who owed his career to Hawthorne's political patronage, refused to issue a search warrant for the estate. The evidence is circumstantial, Miles, D.A. Reynolds had said. His voice slick with a politician's practiced insincerity. A 7-year-old data ping and a locket found by a trespassing detective. It's inadmissible. A fishing expedition. I won't crucify a man of the judge's stature on such flimsy grounds. The injustice was a bitter pill. Miles saw it in the hollowed-out eyes of Thomas and Sarah Vance every time he had to tell them there was no progress. He saw them at a press conference they'd called, standing on the steps of the courthouse. Their faces etched with a grief that had been sharpened into a steely resolve. Sarah, who had seemed so broken, now spoke with a fiery, desperate clarity. Our daughter, Alara, was stolen from us 7 years ago, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Amplified by a dozen news microphones. For 7 years, we have lived in a nightmare of not knowing. Now, we have a lead. A lead that points to the very heart of the justice system we are supposed to trust. We are told that Judge Alistair Hawthorne's property is off limits. We are told his reputation is more important than our daughter's life. We are here to say that no man is above the law. No man is so powerful that he can hide a grave. The Media, smelling blood in the water, seized on the story. The narrative was irresistible: the grieving parents versus the powerful judge. The forgotten case of the Golden Girl cyclist was resurrected, now with a villain worthy of the drama. The court of public opinion was in session, and Judge Hawthorne was on trial. The judge responded with a chilling, calculated silence. He issued a single terse statement through his high-priced lawyer, a man whose smile was as sharp and predatory as a shark's. "My client is a victim of a tragic and opportunistic smear campaign." The statement read, "He joins the Vance family in their grief and hopes the real perpetrator of this heinous crime is brought to justice swiftly." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. The antagonist was not just denying, he was taunting. He was using their grief as a shield, painting himself as a fellow victim. The escalation became brutal. The Hawthorne legal team went on the offensive. They filed a restraining order against Miles, barring him from coming within 500 yards of the estate. They filed a formal complaint against him with the police department, accusing him of harassment, trespassing, and planting evidence. Miles was put on administrative leave, his badge and gun confiscated. He was sidelined, officially powerless. The system he had dedicated his life to was now being used as a weapon against him. For the Vances, the cruelty was more personal. Their quiet life was shattered. News vans were parked outside their small house, day and night. Their story was dissected on talk shows, their grief a commodity for public consumption. But worse was the covert harassment. Late-night phone calls with nothing but silence on the other end. A dead bird left on their doorstep. Thomas's workshop was vandalized, his precious tools stolen, his half-finished guitars smashed to pieces. It was a clear message, a campaign of terror designed to break them, to silence them. The hidden witness, Kane, watched all of this from the shadows of the estate. He was the one making the calls, the one leaving the dead birds. He did it with a cold, detached efficiency, his loyalty to the judge overriding the faint, nagging whispers of his conscience. He saw the Vances on TV, their faces raw with pain, and felt a flicker of something he couldn't name: pity, shame. But then he would see the judge, calm and unassailable in the face of the storm. And the feeling would vanish, replaced by a familiar sense of purpose. He was the protector of the fortress. These people, the Vances, the detective, they were the enemy, laying siege to the only home he had ever known. Julian Hawthorne was crumbling. The renewed focus on the case, the constant presence of his father's lawyers in the house, the suffocating atmosphere of lies and denial, was a corrosive acid on his already fragile psyche. He locked himself in his studio, the canvases piling up, each one a more chaotic and desperate explosion of color than the last. He started drinking heavily, the expensive whiskey from his father's cellar doing little to numb the terror. One evening, he confronted his father in the study. Julian was drunk, his movements clumsy, his words slurred. "They won't stop," he said, his voice shaking. "The parents, that detective, they know they're going to find her." The judge looked at his son with an expression of pure contempt. "They will find nothing," he said, his voice like chips of ice, "because there is nothing to find. Are we clear?" "But I saw her," Julian cried, the words torn from him, a confession 7 years in the making. "I saw you with her, at the edge of the woods. She was trying to get away, she was screaming." The room went deathly silent. The judge rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate, menacing. He walked over to Julian, who shrank back, his drunken bravado evaporating into pure, childlike fear. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The menace was in his eyes, in the coiled tension of his body. "You are unwell, Julian," he said, his voice a soft, venomous whisper. "Your imagination, fueled by alcohol, and your artistic temperament, it plays tricks on you. You are overwrought. You have been under a great deal of stress. You need rest." He placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, his grip like a vice. "You will go to the clinic in Switzerland, the one we discussed. You will rest. You will get better. And when you come back, you will have forgotten all of these fantasies. It was not a suggestion, it was a command, an exile. Julian was being disappeared, sent away until the storm passed. The betrayal was absolute. His own father was willing to sacrifice him, to have him declared mentally unstable. To protect himself, the danger was no longer just external. It was here, in this room. Julian looked into his father's eyes and saw not a father, but a monster. He saw his own future, a life of quiet, medicated oblivion in a sterile white room, his memories, his very identity, erased. The struggle of the witness, the internal conflict, was now externalized. Cain, in the woods, continued his silent war, his loyalty tested with every act of cruelty he was forced to commit. Julian, in the mansion, faced a different kind of imprisonment, his conscience warring with a lifetime of terror. He had a choice: succumb to the exile, to the erasure of his own mind, or find a way to fight back. The conflict had escalated from a search for truth to a brutal, no-holds-barred war for survival. The victim, Alara, was long dead, but her ghost had ignited a fire that was now consuming everyone it touched. The antagonist, the judge, was no longer just hiding a crime. He was actively, cruelly destroying the lives of anyone who dared to challenge him. The tension was a taut wire, humming with the promise of violence. It was no longer a question of if it would snap, but when, and who would be destroyed when it did. The humiliation of the Vances, the danger to Miles, the internal torment of Julian, it was all converging, building towards a breaking point, a moment when the suffocating pressure of the secrets and lies would become too great to bear, and the whole rotten edifice would come crashing down in a spectacular explosion of truth and consequence. The quiet desperation had given way to a roar of defiance, and the silence of the redwoods was about to be shattered forever. The breaking point came not from a shout, but from a whisper, a digital whisper, unearthed from the electronic graveyard of a forgotten device. Julian Hawthorne, sitting in the pre-dawn stillness of his studio, a prisoner awaiting his Swiss exile, found it by accident. He was erasing his life, deleting files from his old laptop, preparing to be wiped clean, when his finger hovered over a folder labeled Sketches_2018. A pang of nostalgia, a morbid curiosity, made him click. And there, buried among forgotten digital drawings and half-finished artistic ideas, was an audio file. He didn't recognize the file name, a random string of numbers and letters. He almost deleted it. But something stayed his hand. He put on his headphones, the expensive, noise-canceling kind his father had bought him, and pressed play. The sound that filled his ears was a cacophony of terror. The wind, whistling through trees. The frantic, ragged gasps of someone running, and a voice. A girl's voice, high-pitched with panic. "Please, let me go. Please, just let me go." And then another voice. His father's cold, calm, utterly devoid of emotion. "You should not have seen me. You should have stayed on the road." Julian ripped the headphones from his ears, his body trembling violently. He remembered the day his father had gifted him the new audio recorder, a high-end device to capture the ambient sounds of the forest for his art. He'd been playing with it that afternoon, near the edge of the property, testing its range, its sensitivity. He had forgotten all about it, his mind burying the memory under layers of fear and denial. He had not just seen, he had recorded. The recording was nearly 10 minutes long. It was a fragmented, chaotic document of Alara Vance's final moments. The sound of a struggle. The dull, sickening thud of a blow. A single choked-off scream. And then, silence. A long, drawn-out silence, punctuated only by the sound of his father's heavy, even breathing. And then, one final, chilling sound. The sound of a shovel hitting the soft, damp earth. Digging. Julian felt a wave of nausea so profound he thought he would pass out. This was it, the proof, the undeniable horrifying truth of what his father had done. The full conspiracy was not just that his father had killed a girl who had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. It was that he had orchestrated a 7-year cover-up, manipulating the law, terrorizing the innocent. and preparing to sacrifice his own son, all to protect his monstrous secret. The stakes shifted in that instant. This was no longer just about Alara Vance, it was about Julian's own survival. It was about stopping a monster who wore the robes of a judge. He knew what he had to do. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar serpent coiling in his gut. But for the first time in his life, it was overshadowed by something else. A burning, righteous rage. He copied the audio file onto a small, encrypted drive. He put the drive in his pocket. It felt as heavy as a tombstone. Miles Corbin was a man adrift. Stripped of his badge, his purpose, he spent his days in his small, cluttered apartment. The blinds drawn, the air thick with the smell of stale bourbon and defeat. The walls were covered with maps of the Hawthorne property, with pictures of Alara Vance, a constant, silent accusation. He was obsessed, a man haunted by a ghost he couldn't save. When his phone rang, he almost didn't answer it. The caller ID was blocked. "Hello?" He answered, his voice a hoarse croak. "Detective Corbin." The voice on the other end was thin, trembling, but resolute. "My name is Julian Hawthorne. I need to meet you. I have something for you. Something that will prove everything." Hope. An emotion Miles thought he had buried for good, shot through him like a jolt of electricity. "Where?" "The place where it ended," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The old lighthouse at Point Reyes. Midnight. Come alone." The line went dead. The tension was a physical thing. A high-voltage current humming in the air. Miles knew it could be a trap. The judge was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are at their most dangerous. But it was a chance he had to take. He put his service revolver, the one he was supposed to have turned in, into the waistband of his jeans. The lighthouse at Point Reyes was a lonely, windswept sentinel, perched on the edge of the world. The fog rolled in from the sea, thick and white, muffling the sound of the crashing waves below. It was a place of ghosts, a fitting location for the exchange of a dead girl's final words. Miles arrived first. He stood in the swirling mist, the cold air biting at his face, his senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Then, he saw a figure emerge from the fog. It was Julian Hawthorne. He looked like a ghost himself, his face pale, and drawn, his eyes wide with a terrified, manic energy. "You came," Julian breathed, clutching a small, black object in his hand. "I didn't think you would." "What do you have, Julian?" Miles asked, his voice low and steady. "Everything," Julian said, holding out the encrypted drive, her voice, his voice, the truth. As Miles reached for the drive, another figure stepped out of the fog behind Julian. It was Kane, the groundskeeper. His face was a mask of grim resolve, his large frame blocking out the faint light from the lighthouse. He was not holding a rifle this time. He was holding nothing. He just stood there, a silent, menacing presence. Julian gasped, spinning around. "Kane, what are you doing here?" "The judge knows," Kane said, his voice a low rumble. "He knows you took the file. He sent me to fix it." The plot twist had twisted again. This wasn't just an exchange. It was a confrontation. A reckoning. Julian stood between the two men, a fragile, terrified figure caught in the crossfire. "You can't let him do this, Kane," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "You know what he is, you know what he did." Kane's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of conflict. The dead eyes seemed to hold a glimmer of a long-buried humanity. He looked from the terrified face of the boy he had watched grow up, to the hard, determined face of the detective. He remembered the sound of the girl's screams, a sound that had echoed in the quietest moments of his life, for 7 long years. He remembered the weight of the shovel in his hands. "He gave me a life," Kane said, the words heavy, as if torn from his very soul. "He gave you a cage," Miles said quietly, his eyes locked on Kane's. "Just like he gave his son. It's not too late to walk out of it." The tension was unbearable. The fate of the entire case, the possibility of justice for Alara Vance, rested on the choice of this one man, this silent, broken witness. Would he choose loyalty to the monster who had created him, or would he finally, after 7 years of silence, listened to the ghost of his own conscience. Kane looked at the encrypted drive in Julian's trembling hand. He looked at Julian, a boy he had once, long ago, taught how to skip stones across the pond on the estate. He looked at the endless, churning fog, a reflection of the confusion in his own mind. And then, he made his choice. He took a step forward, not towards Julian, but towards Miles. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out something. Not a weapon, a photograph. The crumpled picture of the canary yellow bicycle. He held it out to Miles. "He told me to burn it," Kane said, his voice thick with an emotion Miles couldn't decipher. "I never did." He then looked at Julian. "Give him the drive, kid. It's time. It's long past time." This was the confession. Not a signed statement, but something more powerful. The surrender of a secret, the breaking of an oath. The full conspiracy was laid bare. The murder, the cover-up, the intimidation, the complicity of the silent witness. The stakes had reached their absolute peak. It was no longer about a cold case. It was about the public takedown of a man who was the living embodiment of corruption, a man who had perverted the very idea of justice. The fog seemed to swirl around them, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The quiet whisper from a dead girl's ghost had become a roar, and it was about to bring the whole damned fortress crashing down. The courtroom was a tinderbox, packed with a combustible mixture of media, grieving family, and morbidly curious public. The air crackled with anticipation. This wasn't just a preliminary hearing. It was a public execution of a reputation, a spectacle that had dominated every news cycle for weeks. At the center of it all sat Judge Alistair Hawthorne, his face a granite mask of indignation. Flanked by his team of sleek, expensive lawyers, he was not in the judge's chair today. He was at the defendant's table, a position of vulnerability he had never before experienced. The power dynamic had been shattered. Miles Corbin, reinstated, and now the lead witness for the prosecution, felt a grim satisfaction. The encrypted drive from Julian and the photograph from Kane had been the cannonball that breached the fortress walls. The DA, his political calculations utterly appended by the irrefutable evidence and the massive public outcry, had been forced to act. A search warrant had finally been executed. The initial dig at the base of the redwood tree had uncovered what the ground-penetrating radar had confirmed, a skeleton. The dental records confirmed it was Elora Vance. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. The prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious woman named Maria Flores, stood before the court. Her voice was calm, but her words were devastating. "The evidence will show," she began, her eyes locking on Hawthorne, "that the man who swore an oath to uphold the law is, in fact, a murderer. A man who used his power, his position, and his wealth to conceal his crime for 7 long years." The cinematic payoff began not with a bang, but with the press of a button. The prosecution would like to play an audio file for the court. Flores announced, recovered from a device belonging to the defendant's own son, Julian Hawthorne. A hushed silence fell over the courtroom. The judge's lawyer leaped to his feet, shouting objections inadmissible, hearsay, violation of privacy, but the presiding judge, a woman flown in from another county to ensure impartiality, overruled him. "The jury will hear it." The sound filled the room. The wind, the frantic, terrified gasps. And then, Elora Vance's voice, a ghost, crying out from the grave. "Please, let me go. Please, just let me go." The sound was electrifying. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Sarah Vance let out a choked sob, her husband's arm wrapping around her like a steel band. Then came the judge's voice, cold and reptilian. "You should not have seen me. You should have stayed on the road." Asterisk, the courtroom erupted. The judge's face, for the first time, showed a crack in the granite facade. A flicker of pure animal panic in his eyes. He stared at his son Julian, who sat in the front row of the gallery, his face pale but resolute. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Flores let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment before delivering the next blow. The prosecution calls Kane, former groundskeeper of the Hawthorne estate, to the stand. Kane walked to the witness stand, his large frame seeming to shrink in the cavernous room. He was dressed in a borrowed suit that fit him poorly. He looked not at the judge, but at the floor, as he took the oath. Flores's questioning was simple, direct. "Mr. Kane, were you on the Hawthorne property on the afternoon of October 12, 2018? "Yes, ma'am." His voice was a low rumble. "Did you witness an altercation between Judge Hawthorne and a young woman on a bicycle?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you tell the court what you saw?" Kane took a deep breath. He finally lifted his eyes and looked directly at the judge, the man who had been his master, his savior, his God. "I saw him hit her with a rock. She fell. She didn't get back up." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "He told me to get a shovel. He told me where to dig." The confession, delivered in Kane's simple, brutal words, was the final nail in the coffin. The courtroom was in an uproar. Reporters were scrambling, their fingers flying across the screens of their devices. The headline was already written. "The judge is a killer." But the true cinematic payoff, the moment of pure, cathartic revenge, came from an unexpected source. During a recess, as a stoic, emotionless Judge Hawthorne was being led through a throng of reporters and angry onlookers, a figure broke through the police cordon. It was Thomas Vance, the quiet, gentle luthier. His face was a mask of pure, righteous fury. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding a guitar. One of the ones he had built, a beautiful instrument of gleaming maple and rosewood. In one swift, shocking motion, he swung the guitar like a baseball bat, smashing it against the side of the police van where Hawthorne was being placed. The beautiful instrument exploded into 1,000 pieces, the sound, a sharp, percussive crack that silenced the entire crowd. It was an act of symbolic violence, a destruction of beauty in the face of ugliness. "You took my music." Thomas Vance screamed, his voice raw with 7 years of unspeakable pain. "You took the music from my life." He didn't attack the judge, he attacked the silence. He attacked the void that Hawthorne had created in his world. The image was instantly iconic. The grieving father, the shattered guitar, the murderer in handcuffs. It was a viral moment, a raw, unscripted explosion of grief and rage that was more powerful than any legal verdict. It was public justice, delivered not by a gavel, but by a broken instrument. The judge, for his part, was finally, completely, unmasked. As he was shoved into the van, his mask of control slipped entirely. He turned, his face contorted in a snarl of pure, impotent rage, and screamed at his son, who was watching from the courthouse steps. You weak, sniveling worm. You destroyed me." The public arrest was complete. The monster had been exposed, his power stripped away, his secrets laid bare for the world to see. The confrontation was not just in the courtroom, but on the steps of the courthouse. A primal scream of a father's love and a son's rebellion. The poetic twist of fate was this: Alastair Hawthorne, the man who had built his life on the law, was undone by the law. The man who had demanded order was consumed by chaos. The man who had silenced a young woman's voice was condemned by it. The fortress had fallen. The silence was broken. And the sound that replaced it was the satisfying, cathartic crash of a world of lies being smashed to smithereens. The ghost of Alara Vance, the girl on the canary yellow bike, could finally rest. Her last ride had led to a place of darkness, but in the end, it had also led to the light of truth. The trial was a formality. With the audio recording, Kane's testimony, and Julian's corroboration, the verdict was swift and inevitable. Guilty, on all counts: murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. Alastair Hawthorne, the once invincible judge, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The camera flashes that captured his face as the verdict was read illuminated. Not a powerful man, but a hollowed-out shell. His eyes vacant, his legacy reduced to a single, monstrous act. The lion of the judiciary had been declawed, caged, and left to rot in the very system he had once commanded. The aftermath was a landscape of quiet ruins and fragile new beginnings. Miles Corbin visited the Vances' small house a few weeks after the sentencing. The news vans were gone. The quiet had returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief, but a lighter, more peaceful stillness. He found Thomas Vance in his workshop. The room was clean, organized, and he was working. The scent of sawdust and wood glue filled the air. On his workbench lay the pieces of a new guitar, its frame just beginning to take shape. "I didn't think I'd ever build again," Thomas said, not looking up from his work. His hands, steady now, moved with their old familiar grace. The music was gone. He took it, but then I realized he can't take it if I don't let him. I have to build again. For her. Sarah Vance came into the workshop, carrying a tray with 3 cups of tea. The grayness had receded from her face. There were still lines of sorrow etched around her eyes. Wounds that would never fully heal, but there was also a light in them that Miles hadn't seen before. A flicker of peace. "We're starting a foundation," she told Miles. The Elora Vance Foundation. For victims of violent crimes, for families who get lost in the system. To make sure no one else has to wait 7 years for justice. They had found a way to transform their pain into purpose. Their daughter's tragic end would be the beginning of a new legacy, one of help and healing. It was a bittersweet victory, a life built from the ashes of another. But it was a life. Miles left them to their quiet work, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with bourbon. He drove out to the coast, to the windswept bluff where the lighthouse stood, sentinel. He found Julian Hawthorne there, sketching in a notepad. The chaos was gone from his art. He was sketching the lighthouse, the lines clean, precise, realistic. "I'm not going to Switzerland, Julian," said a small, wry smile on his face. "I think I'll stay here. See what it's like to live without being afraid." He had testified against his father, an act of unimaginable courage that had severed their bond forever. He was an orphan now, in a way, but he was also free. "Kane sends his regards," Julian added. "He took a deal, manslaughter. He'll be out in a few years. He said he wants to work with horses, somewhere far away from redwood trees." The 2 men, the broken detective and the broken son, stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the endless expanse of the ocean. They were 2 survivors of the same shipwreck, washed ashore on a new, unfamiliar land. The final scene, the last emotional echo, takes place a year later. A simple, elegant gravestone now stands in the local cemetery. It reads, Alara Vance, 1996 to 2018. Daughter, adventurer, music. The grave is covered in fresh flowers, and leaning against the stone is a small, perfect, canary yellow bicycle. A memorial, a tribute, a haunting reminder of the vibrant life that was lost. Miles Corbin stands before the grave, his hands in his pockets. He is no longer a detective. He had retired a month after the trial. The fire in his belly finally extinguished, replaced by a quiet sense of completion. He had fought his last war. He had brought the ghost home. He feels a presence beside him, and turns to see Thomas and Sarah Vance. They exchange a quiet, understanding look. There are no words necessary. They stand together for a long time, 3 people bound by a tragedy that had almost destroyed them, but had instead, in some strange, sad way, saved them. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, a gentle breeze rustles the leaves of the trees. It sounds, for a fleeting moment, like wind chimes, like laughter, a lingering emotional echo of the girl who was gone, but would never, ever be forgotten. The cost of truth had been immense, a price paid in years of pain and sorrow. But in the quiet peace of the evening, under the watchful eyes of a father, a mother, and the man who had found their daughter, there was a sense of an ending. A sense of justice. A sense of peace. The final route had been logged, the final destination reached, and the silence that remained was no longer a silence of fear, but a silence of remembrance.